Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Astro Imaging channel. I hope everyone had a nice holiday. I know we all did, but it's nice to be back, and we've got another great show for you tonight. Steeve Body is here, and he's going to talk to us about image acquisition and processing techniques for data that he acquired under suburban skies. But before we get into Steve's presentation, we just wanted to talk a little bit about something on the upcoming calendar. We've pinned down a date for the next PAIC workshop, and we're going to tell you a little bit about that tonight. Rory's here, and he'll explain what we're doing. I'm just going to pull that up. So let me just share my screen here so we can see the web page. All right, so this is the workshop page here on our website, and we've got the M101 data loaded up here. So Rory, oh, you're on mute, Rory. So can you, there you go. You want to tell us a little bit about this next workshop?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Rory. I hope everyone's having a happy new year so far. Eric Coles submitted data for us this time, and it is of M101 with and without the new supernova that was recently in the Pinwheel Galaxy. So that nova has luminance data, and the rest of the data will be LRGB. We'll do that workshop on the 31st, and the deadline to submit is on the 17th. So you can go over to this website that Patrick has up here, and you'll see where to submit. You'll see where to download and submit your images, and then we'll get back to you via email, and we'll feature all your images on the day of the TAC workshop. And we're also looking for about 4 or 5 people to do a mini presentation of how they edited their images and just kind of the highlights that make their images good. Thank you.
Rory, let me just add one thing. This is Eric. That I got a complete data set before the supernova, and that initial L data that you see there is before the supernova. Then once it came out, I went back and got the L data with the supernova. So you can make an image with and without the supernova, and that's what I did and posted on Astrobin. That's all.
Great. Well, thanks, Rory, for that introduction and explanation about the workshop, and thank you, Eric, for providing this data. It looks nice, and I'm sure it'll be neat to see it. It's always neat to see what different folks do with the same data, and sometimes it's really quite striking how different 2 different people or 5 different people, as hopefully we'll have a number of submissions, will come out and deal with the same data set. So while you're here on this page, you know, we've had a number of workshops in the past, and all of the data is still up here, and so when you're downloading Eric's M101 data, feel free to grab any of these other great data sets and work them up. And we've had shows on those, and you can see how folks have approached those or do those as well. So let me stop sharing here.
One thing, there's a comment over on the YouTube from oh, I misspelled your name. Oh, Eric. Anyway, he's asked, can we use artificial intelligence in the workshop? And that may be just a joke, but it may also be the fact that, you know, there's an awful lot of programs we use today, like noise reduction and star separation and stuff like that, that does in fact use artificial intelligence. And yes, you can use that as long as you tell us you're using it. But that joke could go much further than that. And no, you can't use that kind of stuff. So, okay.
All right. Yeah, thanks for addressing that, Alex. And I think you're right. Certainly, I think we're all pretty enamored of Russ's tools, the various exterminator tools, star exterminator, noise exterminator, blur exterminator, all of which use AI. I know a lot of folks like to use topaz denoise and things like that. Certainly, I think that's all fair game. So obviously, we could get some weird submission with created by AI that I think we would probably frown at, I suppose. But the regular tools, yeah, go for it. So those are really the state of the art these days. So all
Okay,
right,
I'm
and so
sorry to, can I just take another 30 seconds as far as AI? Yes, there are AI tools that you can use, and you can ask it to take that image and then do something interesting with it. Please don't do that, or if you do it for your own use. We certainly don't want it posted here. And actually, Astrobin has rules against that if you are an Astrobin. And if you do post that kind of image, they will ask you to take it down.
good point. Good point. All right. Well, so in next week's guest, Kai Young, he is here with us as well tonight, and he's going to be presenting next week about some unconventional uses of the ZWO C-Star S50. And he was kind enough to join us tonight and give us a little taste of his presentation for next week. So, Kai, if you wouldn't mind just giving the elevator pitch, so to speak.
Sure. So I'm Kai. I have been in astrophotography for probably 5 to 6 years. And give you a background, I just acquired an EKR8, and I'm looking forward to that. But for next week, I'll be talking about C-Star. I started playing with C-Star because it's so easy to do and no wires, and I thought it's a great tool for hobbyists and educators or even newbies. So you see, there's going to be a lot of conventional images being shown by C-Star, but I'm more focusing on more interesting stuff. So I've been showing some uses in spectroscopy, doing that, as well as and modifying that into equatorial mode. So I'll be doing that.
All right, well, thank you. That sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to that presentation next week, and I know a lot of other folks are as well. So that brings us to tonight's presentation. And as I mentioned earlier, Steeve Body is with us, and he's going to talk about image capture and post-processing techniques. And if you take a look at Steve's Astrobin portfolio, we did post a link in the show notes. You'll see right away that he really knows his stuff. And while Steeve is clearly very skilled when it comes to post-processing, he also gives a lot of thought to framing and subject placement and other compositional factors, the kind of things that really make a good photograph into a great photograph. So I know he's going to talk about some of those types of things as well. So Steeve, if you're ready, we can turn it over to you and you can get going with your presentation.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Patrick. First, Happy New Year 2024 to everyone. Hopefully, we're going to get some clear skies, especially for me in Melbourne, which is a hard thing to come by. But thank you so much for inviting me today to present. I've been a big fan of the channel for a long time. I've learned so much through here. So happy to be able to contribute a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen with you and show you what I've got on the menu today. All right, cool. So let me hit play. So I wanted to go through my general process of how I capture images from my city backyard and how I try to get the most out of it. Now it's a really big conversation that could go for many, many hours, but I try to synthesize to the essence of what I think I've learned through the past few years doing this. So what we're going to go through today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what I'm doing, who I am, and then I'm going to go through the steps of how I optimize my equipment, how I plan what I'm going to shoot in my sessions, how I compose the frame, and a rough overview of my processing workflow. Same thing, processing, I could spend 3-4 hours just on that. So I'm really going to try to show you the essence of what I'm doing. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time to answer some questions at the end. But if you have any questions whilst I'm presenting, please do not hesitate to put it in the chat and I'll try to answer those as we go. So myself, I'm a music composer, producer, and sound designer by trade, and I also teach these things at university. And actually that has helped me a lot in learning about post-processing astro images, as I found the workflow of mixing sound and mixing light actually quite similar. So I come from a place called Reunion Island, which I'm pretty sure none of you have heard before, or if you have, you may not know where it is. And it's right next to Madagascar here. It's a tiny little French island, in case you couldn't figure out the accent. And I'm from this place here, Saint-Pierre. I moved to Australia in 2001 to pursue a career in the music industry, where I did a degree in sound engineering. And then, yeah, I ended up having a career in music. I started astrophotography, I think like a lot of people recently during the COVID lockdown in mid-2020. And it's been a massive learning curve, and I've pretty much caught the disease and it's not letting go, and I'm absolutely loving it. I live in Melbourne with my wife, Lauren, and my son, Sebastian, and my Bluey Tyke is right there. This is my website if you want to check it out. I've got some of my images and my music work in here, and this is my Astrobin link. So this is pretty much the progression that I've been through for the past 3 years. I started with a phone stuck on a collapsible Newtonian all the way to where I am now. So this is pretty much the same image of the same target I took throughout 3 years. This is with my phone, pretty rubbish, but you know, at the beginning I thought, oh, this is awesome, I can get something. And then I did a bit of research and found out that actually it wasn't very good, and I started to research how to take good images. So get a decent mount, learn about tracking, polar alignment, and slowly invest in more equipment. This stage here for me was really the stage where I wanted to make sure this hobby was going to stick around before I started to invest more money in it. And it definitely took a hold and started to empty my bank account, and I started to invest in more equipment. I got absolutely obsessed with automation, and everything is absolutely automated on my rig. And I will show you that in a minute, because I live in Melbourne, it gets pretty cold, and I like everything to be automated and me to be nicely warm inside with a glass of wine. So as I went through it, my processing also got better, and that's what I'm going to share with you how I get these kind of images now. This is my telescope. I've got an ASCA 107 PHQ. It's a flat field APO. Doesn't care about backfocal distance. It's really easy to set up. I got a 1600 mm. I got secondhand, some 3nm NTI filters, and a whole bunch of gear to automate the whole setup. I use the softwares that I think everybody's using: Photoshop, Lightroom, PixInsight, BlurX, NoiseX, StarX, and Nina for capturing pretty much anything that's out there that will help me make better images. I go for it. I don't prescribe to just PixInsight or just Photoshop. I tend to use all of it. I'm in Bentley in the state of Victoria in Australia, near Melbourne, and it's a Bortle 6-7 zone. So it's not the best sky in the world, but I take about 90% of my images from here. So before we can really go into the nitty-gritty of how I do things, I really started to have to come up with what makes up a good astrophoto. Because at the beginning, I was happy with a half blurry picture of a moon, but essentially you need to formalize some sort of opinion about what is a good astrophoto. And I brought it down to all these main points here. So to me, it really starts with composition and framing, that you actually framing the object you're trying to capture effectively. You got good resolution, the image is sharp. I love zooming in on images, and I'm a pixel peeper, so I want to make sure that my images look good when zoomed in as well. But I want it to look detailed, natural, and not over sharpened. Exposures, just make sure you have enough data that you can actually stretch the data without having a massive amount of noise, that you deal with the noise properly, you don't have any gradients, you don't have any artifacts, you've got good stars, round, shiny, colorful, you got a good balance. Now, we all have different thresholds of how much saturation is too much. Me, I'm a little bit more on the, I guess, pastel side, maybe, in what I personally like. But essentially, I try to balance things in a way that's pleasing to my eye, and hopefully other likes it too. I really want images to have an impact when you first look at them. I really want you to be drawn in and spend time looking at the image. any sort of movement or storytelling within the frame, I think that something that stimulates your imagination is also important to hold your attention. Depth and contrast, so some sort of three-dimensional look to the image. I personally really like that. I'm not a fan of flat-looking images. Natural sky background, well-balanced, no color cast. When you compare your image to other image of that target online, it stands its own ground, and most importantly, it's a processing technique. And that really, in astrophotography, I think processing is a huge part of the game, at the very least 50%, if not more. For narrowband imaging, I think like processing is even quite a bit more than that. So to me, that's what makes up a good image, and that's what I'm trying to achieve with every single image I take. So the first thing that I had to do was to optimize my gear so I could capture good data. It's pretty much good data in, good data out, and bad data in. It's pretty hard to fix up, even with things like Blur Exterminator and things like that. So what I've learned through all the gears that I've been through is these are the key elements that I've really fine-tuned to have a trouble-free system. Number one, the USB hub. This is the first thing that's going to fail on you. You're going to spend a ridiculous amount of money for a USB hub for it to be, reliable. So I bought one of these Pegasus Astro industrial USB hub, and I've never had a connection issue ever since. Clean power as well. I've fried a couple EQ6R board because of bad power. This clean things up. I don't have any flex of my focuser because I've got so many things on my image train that the thing is pretty much racked over way in almost. I used to have a little bit of sensor tilt, and literally a $2 little chim fixed that up. No differential flexure because I'm using off-axis guiding, and I've got a flat field APO, so I don't need to calculate back focus distance and get the sensor exactly at the right spot. That takes care of itself. So it makes it a really easy to use system. And that's really what I wanted to do. I would have loved to have an F2 system, but these are very low tolerance. I wanted to have some things that got me imaging good sharp images right away. So this is what I've got. An EQ6R, I've tried to get the balance pretty good so I could get good cable management and good guiding. I'm guiding on average at 0.4 RMS with this system. My pixel scale is about 1.05, so I'm guiding at half that, and that translates in really sharp images when I'm imaging. So once you kind of get all that right, then you can start to think about acquisition. And before you think about acquisition, you need to think about planning. What are you going to shoot? When are you going to shoot it? What's good to shoot right now? And depending on where you are, what's the best target to start with. So the way I plan my images is mostly by looking at what others have done on Astrobin and finding the best images of some of these targets that I want to shoot and having a look at how this has been done by others. Sometimes I really like to find a really nice big wide field image, like let's say of a large Magellan cloud, bring that into the Nina framing assistant, play it, solve it, and then have a bit of a play with framing. That's also a nice thing to do. Sometimes I use some of these other tools like everybody else. I think Telescopia, Stellarium, worldwidetelescope.org is a pretty good one, as you can overlay some sky surveys, all sky surveys, which is pretty good. And the HIM Deep Sky Compendium is also a great tool for planning. But really, these two is mostly what I use. Often, like I said, I will go on a big wide field mosaic or a shot with a camera lens, and then I bring that in and I try to play around with framing. This is actually an 18-panel mosaic of Vela that I took, and I use that to actually research the subject and find little parts of the nebula that I wanted to shoot in high resolution. So that's kind of what I like to do personally, and research the framing and spend a lot of time playing around with the framing. To be honest, sometimes I spend 2-3 hours just going around the target and fiddling with framing up until I feel I got it right before I commit to shooting a target for 20-30 hours. Once I've got the framing right, I start to research the color palettes that I want to be using. Again, Astrobin is a massive saver for that, see what other people have done. And most of the time, I definitely want to shoot O3 emission. So I have the options later on. And then after that, I can choose what I want to do with post-processing. LRGB, when I shoot from the cities, it's pretty much going to be 4 stars only, but sometimes I do love shooting reflection nebulae when I get out of the city a little bit. But essentially, really think about the color palette even before you start shooting, so you can figure out how much time you're going to need on each filter and when it's going to be a good time to shoot that. To manage light pollution, pretty much these are my go-to little points that I try to follow as much as I can when possible. So I try to pick targets that go pretty high in the sky, at least above 50 degrees, and hopefully that goes through the meridian and close to the zenith, because up there I get way less problem with light pollution. I pretty much only shoot with narrowband filters and pretty much emission nebulae primarily. LRGB filters, I use those, but primarily to capture the stars, and I tend to have exposures of 60 seconds or lower, and that's easier to manage any gradients with shorter exposures like this. When I shoot for the stars with RGB filters, I try to shoot them when it's pretty high in the sky and only on one side of the meridian. And the reason for that is that once I stack my RGB filters, if they're both on one side of a meridian and there's a little bit of aberration, at least it's only going to be on one side, and a tool like BXT is going to make it really, it's going to fix that really easily. I don't have much aberration issues, but that's something that I tend to do, and I get much better star colors by doing that. I try to get at least 20 hours per target. That's very minimum with my setup at f7. I pretty much completely avoid shooting anything reflection nebula or galaxies from where I am. You really want dark sky for this. I avoid shooting O3 when the moon is around. I avoid shooting within 20 degrees of the moon, even in narrowband, and I avoid shooting LRGB or O3 during astronomical dawn or dusk. So this is kind of what I'm doing to try to get the best signal to noise ratio, essentially, and give me good data that's going to be easier to process. Managing the weather. Now, I really wish I had, a cloud gun, but I don't quite have that. But what I'm using is a website called MeteoBlue. It's got a great multi-modal forecast system, and it also has a lot of really cool graphs. And I thought it would be fun to compare Namibia to Melbourne. So here, as you see, Namibia, what you have in yellow are the clear days, beautiful sky over there, and this is Melbourne. So this, my friend, here is why you really need to plan in Melbourne, because you're not going to have a lot of nights. Last year, I managed to produce 25 images. And you really need to know what you want to shoot in advance and plan for these short little spurts where something's going to happen. And you see most of the times that's clear, it's around January, February, and March, where in Australia, we have short nights. So again, you really need to plan for this. Composition. Now, to me, it's something that I really try to get right. Putting a target directly in the center of a frame, I think you can probably do a little bit better if you have a little bit more knowledge about composition and framing in particular. The first question that really pops up when you put an image together is, are you going to do it in portrait or are you going to do it in landscape? Because that's really first step. So for example, here I've got a few images open in here, and you can see that with some of these images, so this one was shot to be in landscape. But if I start to actually move it around, you will see that it does not work in any other orientation, at least not to me. I don't like this. I don't like this. I don't like this. I only like this. Some other targets, though, like this one, because of the way it was composed, seem to work really well in all sorts of different orientations. And you'll find out later on that I'm using a particular composition technique that makes it easy for me to be able to flip the image around like this and it still feel right. It's more of a feeling thing. This one, same. It works nice like this. And it kind of works in most orientation as well. This one was really planned. It's a 2-panel mosaic, and it was really planned to be shot in portrait. And I don't think it works in any other orientation. So again, this is something I really had to think about and to get right before I shot this for 30 hours or so. Same thing for this one. It was planned to be shot in portrait, and I think maybe it works like this, but it certainly to me does not work like this or like this. So again, you're trying to kind of sort this out. Same thing here. I think this works like this. I think it works like this, and I don't think it works in these two ways. So again, really trying to figure out what's going to work best in your composition as just pure orientation of the frame. But the next step is within the frame, where do I place these, the point of focus and the orientation? There's an entire science in the way we perceive images in our first impression. Where do our eyes first go, and how our eyes are going to travel through the frame? You probably heard of the rule of thirds before, but essentially what this does, it splits the image in 9 individual squares of the same size. And it's a fundamental principle in composition and photography in general. So what you're trying to do is to place a point of interest in your photograph around the line intersections here. Because what's going to happen is when you're first going to look at the image, your eyes is going to go straight to one of these points, especially if there is something around that point. So for example, the Seagull Nebula here, the eye of the nebula starts to focus on this, so your eye is just going to go straight through this before it starts to travel around the rest of the image. I'm also using a diagonal here. I really like using diagonals where the actually flow of the nebula kind of goes this way across the frame. This one here, M17. M17 itself is really bright, and if you don't frame this right, your eye is going to go straight here and get stuck here and not go anywhere in the frame. So what I did here is that to actually place this part of the nebula in that junction. And what it does is your eye is first going to go around here and then move down to M17. So you get to enjoy more of the frame and spend more time looking at it. There's also that kind of flow here going downwards through the nebula here, which I kind of like. It gives a bit of dynamic composition to the frame, which I like. So rule of thirds, really kind of basic one to use. That you should try out if you haven't. I must say that before I go and use all these rules, I first try to get something that feels right, and then to tweak it a little bit and refine the framing, I will or I may use some of these rules to help out. One of the second rules that I like to use, which is a little bit harder to use when you first start out, is the golden spiral. Essentially, this is based on the Fibonacci sequence. And you've probably seen that before, that it kind of swirl. And you're trying to do something similar when you may put a point of interest where the end of the swirls end up being, but you're also trying to line up objects along that natural arc here. So this photo here, we see that the bottom of the nebula follows the nice arc of this. And it also has the point of focus really right at the end of the spiral. This one, I'm mostly focused on putting the star cluster up here at the end of the spiral. So this is one way you can use this. But another way of using this is, instead of looking at the spiral, is split the image into 2 parts. So essentially with a ratio of 1 to 1.618. So essentially here, if you cross a line just at that junction, what you're going to have here is 1 and then 1.618. So it's like the rule of third, if you wish, but it's a little bit higher. And what you can do is start splitting the image and figuring out how your composition works here. So for example, if I split the image here, often this part of the frame should be able to work almost as a standalone frame. If it does, it means it's balancing really nicely the whole composition. Also, another thing, that particular spiral doesn't have to be on the whole frame. You can have mini spiral within the frame. So for example, if I make a split here, I will have a spiral here, but down here, if I actually split it in two, I see that I have a spiral going here, and I have another one going here. And it kind of feels like it's balancing the image a little bit. So you can do this with this one. You can't really do this with this particular frame here, but essentially you can kind of balance the image that way using this particular golden spiral. I gotta say, it doesn't really work with every image, but sometimes it does help. Another one that I like to use a lot is the golden triangles. And essentially what you do is that you divide a frame in two with a diagonal. And then with the other two corner, you join them in a perpendicular angle to that main diagonal. And same thing, you are trying to place the center of focus around some of these intersections. Another thing that I like is to follow the structure of a nebula around that line, which can be a really nice thing. So you see here M8, the core of M8 is really close to that center, and the orientation of M8 itself is a little bit tilted on the right side, and that kind of gives a sense of balance. Same thing here, the dragons really following this line, and the head of the dragons is around that intersection. Another thing with the golden triangles is the balance between the triangles to get things feeling right. So if you have a look at this frame here, for example, this is the same amount of negative space in this triangle and this one. It creates a nice kind of symmetry, and same thing here. And if you have a look at each of the triangles, they almost have the same amount of luminosity in each of them. Same thing here. If you have a look at all the triangles, they kind of balance each other out as well. So that's something quite important to use with the golden triangles. And I tend to intuitively use this a lot more than any other techniques for some reason. So it must be some things that I particularly like about this. And then finally, the golden series, we're going to finish on the golden grid. Now it's exactly like the golden spiral, but we don't use a spiral. We just use that 1 to 1.618 division. So 1.618, or same thing on the other way around, 1.618. Same thing, you can try to put things around the intersection, but with this particular image, the only thing that I did was to that line in the nebula to follow that top line here, and that kind of created a balance in the image that I like, where you have a fairly heavy section at the bottom for the 1.618 version of the frame, and this a little bit lighter section at the top here. So again, these are kind of guidelines that you can use to help you frame your object and make them more striking when you first look at them. I think that first impression when you look at an image is what's going to draw you in, and then hopefully you can zoom in on the image and then it doesn't collapse when you do that. So that's kind of how I use framing in particular. Cool. So
Steve,
now, yeah.
Before you go on, that's a good, yeah, a couple people have asked how you make those grids. Are they overlays, layers in Photoshop?
Sure, let's have a look at that. I can go into Photoshop here and let's open maybe an image. I've got one, for example, of Vela. So this one is the full mosaic. So it's going to take a little bit of time. Okay, cool. So let's say, for example, I wanted to frame something in here. So you have a little framing tool here in Photoshop, and here you actually have a different representation of this grid. So for example, if I wanted to, let's say, zoom in and capture something here, I could, as I start moving the frame here, you see it's starting to show some of these guides. And here I can choose exactly how I may want to frame this and use these techniques to start framing. So for example, here, if I use that, let's say I wanted to put the eye here around this section, and I'm already kind of balancing the frame nicely. But then I can try with different techniques like the golden ratio, for example. And here you see the golden ratio is pretty much bang on here as well. Let's try the golden spiral. And here the golden spiral, I can start to move things around. So sometimes you can change the orientation. So if you press Shift O, you can actually move that orientation around. All right. So for example, here, I think what would work well is using this. So you see, maybe I want to orientate that kind of thing alongside this line. This doesn't have to point at a center of interest. It can also point at a negative space. And here I can sort of frame things like this, maybe zoom out a little bit and get some things that kind of instantly, looking at this, feels nice. So that's how I tend to do a little bit of framing research using this. Does that answer the question?
Now, is that a drop-down menu or is that
In Photoshop, it's right at the toolbar at the top, and it's when you select the. This is where they are. This is the only place I know where to find those.
is that a window as well?
I have no idea. I'm using a Mac. I don't know if it's on the Windows version right up there.
No. Is it in your Windows drop-down menu?
Yeah, I don't
Maybe.
see that just natively. I think you might be something you have to enable.
And it comes up when you access the crop tool. So
Ah.
it's in that
Yeah.
part.
Because
A lot
I'm
of these-
using, you see, I'm using the photography workspace arrangement in Photoshop, and that brings all these tools automatically, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah, if you go into crop mode, that button does appear. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Cool. So that's definitely something really useful. I really wish they had that built into the Nina framing assistant as well, just these kind of guidelines. But anyways, that's kind of how I do the framing. Any other questions?
No, I think we're all set now, Steve.
Cool. So processing. Now, this is the part where literally I could spend 5 hours doing this, but I'm going to try to synthesize everything I do. So I've made a nice little pretty graph for you with pretty much my entire workflow from beginning to end. So first thing first, I use two software. I use PixInsight and I use Photoshop. They're the main two things that I use. I use PixInsight to do all the stacking and pre-processing and get the frame pretty much prepared to then be processed. But I do process in Photoshop because in Photoshop I can work in layers and I can work completely non-destructively, which I really like to do. I'm a sound mixer. I like to have faders and I like to be able to solo things and listen to all the elements separately and see how they'll interact with each other. So that's why I'm using Photoshop. So I start with pretty much, I blink preview all my frames, call anything that doesn't look good. I send everything through the subframe selector to call even some more. That's why you need a lot of data to get, good stuff before you start stacking. I use WPPP and non-compromise like setting. I have it auto cropping. I'm using linear normalization because that really helps with gradient, especially from a light polluted backyard. I drizzle 2x because I found that it really makes BXT sing with my particular pixel scale. And sometimes I do cosmetic correction afterwards if there are some dead pixels that show up, but most of the time I don't really need to do that. I end up with all my frames in PixInsight, and the first thing that they get is a bit of Graxpert AI to remove a gradient, and that does it beautifully automatically, which is beautiful. These are going to be my star integration. So star combination, I use BXT in correction mode only, as I found that it makes SPCC do a better job. And then I use BXT again afterwards to reduce the stars. And then after that, I'm going to stretch, denoise, and remove the stars. Sometimes I remove the stars before stretching, but it depends on the image. Sometimes you need to stretch the image a little bit to get a better star extermination, and sometimes you don't. With really faint stuff where I'm going to need to really push it fairly hard with stretching, I tend to remove the stars first. Sometimes I even use linear noise reduction before stretching for super faint stuff. So this kind of stuff moves around a little bit depending on the image, but 95% of the time what you're seeing here is what I'm going to use. And I end up with a bunch of starless images. I've got the HA03 and SE stars that I'm literally not going to use. The RGB starless I'm very rarely going to use, and I'm mostly going to have the RGB stars and my narrowband starless images ready to go. So that's the end of my image preparation. Then I bring everything to Photoshop, and here I may do any non-linear cosmetic correction, which is, I've got a 1600 mm, so I get a bit of micro lensing effect from time to time, and I'm gonna have to remove that in Photoshop. Then I create a luminance layer. So pretty much blending, it's going to be my detail layer where I'm going to try to bring most of the details that I know the filters together. Most of the time, HA contains everything, but not all the time. So sometimes, for example, I've got one here for you with, yeah, this one, which is M8, for example. This is the HA frame. And this is me doing my luminance layer. We actually brought in some of the details here you actually only have in the sulfur. So if it's just HA, this thing is completely gets wiped out. You don't see it. And I try to bring some of that detail into the luminance layer. So I've got a way I'm doing this that I'm happy to go more in depth about this maybe at the end. I don't want to spend too much time on this yet, but this is a big part of what I do is making sure I get this right. Then I put a color map together and I blend it with the luminance. I do all sorts of color grading and saturation to the nebula and the stars, any contrast detail enhancement. And then I actually don't screen the stars in Photoshop. I export them both and I use this little script made by Bill Blenchen and Mike Cranfield, which actually revert stretch the stars and screen them back into the nebula. And you actually get much better color profile, and the star core is also stays in check and doesn't get clipped as you screen the stars back in. So I love this little tool, and it's making the stars look great. So essentially, in a nutshell, this is you get the raw frame, you remove the gradients, remove stacking artifacts, remove dead pixel, correct the shape of the stars. Then you're going to stretch it. You're going to recover any details that you can. So things like deconvolution, noise reduction, star removal. And then after that, I get out of PixelSite and it's in Photoshop. Here you see I've removed that little artifact in Photoshop and get the frame ready to be processed. But here it's still pre-processing. Any other questions at this stage before I move on?
I don't see any, but
Cool.
stay tuned.
So essentially, when you're asexual processing, you're going to start with a green goblin and you try to turn it into a princess, pretty much. So this is my green goblin I start with, and I do have a plan when I'm mixing the SHO, is that what I want to come up. So essentially, I want my image to tell you where the emissions are and how they're blending together. So I don't want it to only look pretty. I want it to tell you some information. So HA is going to be mostly in red. This is where you're going to have predominantly HA. Yellow is going to be where HA and sulfur meet. Blue is primarily going to be oxygen, and purple is going to be where HA and oxygen meet. So that's really what I'm trying to do here. I'm going to try to balance the emissions in a way that's going to show this. Of course, most emissions are going to be, HA is going to overwhelm everything. I need to balance things in a way that you get these colors coming through. But essentially, that's my purpose when I do color mapping. This is the way I set my Photoshop edit layout most of the time, and then there may be additional layers that pops in between these, but essentially this is what I do. So I've got my 3 emission layers here, and they will all be using blending options in Photoshop, where you right click on a layer and you choose which color channel you're targeting. So here HA is going to be green, O3 is going to be blue, and sulfur is going to be red. They all have level and curves tied to them, so I can balance all these emissions. This is where a lot of the base of the color map is going to come from, the way you balance these layers together. So I actually have a full Photoshop session. I'm going to go through all the layers one by one, so you see the iterative process of how it all stacks up together. But essentially, this is where it starts. Then you may lose a little bit of luminosity doing that and playing with this. So I've got some global curves to bring that back up and maybe enhance the contrast a little bit more. And then after that, I've got a color grading section. So pretty much I like most of the time, exclusively use selective colors. And I have them all separate on a different layer. So I've got red, green, cyan, blue, yellow, magenta, neutral, and black, and any other things that I need to do, and a little bit of vibrance maybe at the end. The reason I have them all on separate layers and not in one is because I can control the blending amount of each of these layers separately as I'm going to go through. I can also do something where I can bypass a layer and see exactly what it's doing, if I overdone something or not. Blinking, A/B-ing between the way the image was before to the way it is after you process is extremely important, because you really get to tell what you've done and is what you've done really benefiting to the image or not. So having these layers like that, I can very easily bypass layers and see what's going on. Then this is where I've got my luminance layer coming in to bring in all the details. And I may need to adjust some curves to make it blend nicely with the color map. And then I've got sharpening happening with high pass and mask a little bit later on. And then I screen the stars. Now, this entire thing is going to build my color map. Then I tend to grab that whole lot here and turn that into a smart object so I can use something like camera raw as an editable filter. And essentially, that entire thing is going to collapse into a folder. I'm going to have something called main edit, and I'm going to apply what I call the final grade and the mastering stage of the image. I'm going to have a smart filter like camera raw applied here. And if you double click on this, you can have access to this whole edit again and transform anything. But here, it will collapse down to this. I will have a black color fill to remove any noise in the background, maybe a last little bit of noise reduction, and I screen the stars just a preview to see what's going on. So let's actually see this in action. So this is, let me get out of this. So this is pretty much the final, collapsed edit here, the main edit with the smart filter. And I've got a little bit of a color fill and stars and all that stuff. Essentially, this is where I started. This is the initial state. And this is the end state. So we're going to go through that. So if you double click on that smart object here, which is where I'm applying a camera raw filter, and you see the beautiful thing about that is that I can see what the camera filter is doing, where I can bypass it on and off. And I can change that filter by double clicking on it, which makes it really easy to see what's happening. So if I double click on this here, and that's the mastering stage, it's right at the end, I can change how much of what I did in camera raw I want to blend, or I can right click on it and edit that smart filter. And I will go back to exactly what I did. And here you can see, this is the end of the color map. And this is what I do to bring the colors back up. So yeah, dismiss camera raw. Let's actually go into the main edit so you can see how everything comes together. Let me collapse all my folders. And so you can see what's going on. Okay, let's actually kill this. So I've got my SHO blend right at the end. I'm going to literally bypass all the layers so you see where it starts. So SHO blend, curves, color grade, noise reduction for the colors, luminosity, sharpening, vibrance. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm doing. Now let's actually delete everything here and start from the beginning. Let's go in my SHO folder. So I'm going to start with HA. Oops. So HA. So how do I make HA and assign it to the green channel? So you right click on the layer and you go blending options and you can select green here. And I did exactly the same thing with O3. That's set to blue, and then sulfur is set to red. So as I bring these frames the way they were, they've just been prepared, and I bring them in one by one, you see already kind of what's happening. Okay. One thing that I love doing is right now I'm going to bypass the HA and I'm going to look at the way the sulfur and the O3 are blending together. So I get a feel for what each emission is contributing, and especially how is it both contributing to the background. So here I can see that the red in the background and the blue in the background are pretty equal, but I can also see the differences here of where the oxygen is and where the sulfur isn't. And then now when I bring the HA, it's going to be really obvious what it's adding to the frame. And here I can see that it's definitely adding too much, And my background now is becoming green, so it's definitely too powerful, and I may need to tame that. So first thing that I'm going to do is with my levels, I'm going to put a level so I can balance the black point for each image. And here I'm going to bring all the emissions together, and you see what it's going to do. It's now the background is nice and dark. And then with the midtone slider on the HA here, for example, it's at 0.96, I'm going to start balancing the emissions a little bit. So for example, here I left it almost at 1, but if I go to the oxygen, you see that I had to boost it to 1.34. If I left it to 1, you will see that, you know, I don't really see the contribution from the oxygen, and I need to boost it a little bit to bring more of that color hue coming in. Same thing with the sulfur. Sulfur, I had to boost it a lot. This is the way it was. 1, we don't really see where the sulfur is so much, so I had to boost it to 1.42. Oops. And here, all of a sudden, we see where the sulfur is. My goal at this stage is to really clearly define 4 to 5 colors that I can then boost later on. I want to see where all these emissions are. So I'm first doing that with levels. Then with curves, I got to reinforce the dynamic range of certain parts of these emissions. So here with HA, actually bringing it down a little bit is going to bring a little bit more color to this region here. So you see all of a sudden, I get a lot more of the purple and blue that were overwhelmed before by the HA. Then what I'm going to do with the blue channel here, I'm going to actually boost the midtones a little bit. And that's going to bring a little bit more vibrancy and contrast to this section here. So I'm really getting a lot more demarcation between the emissions. And then finally, the sulfur, I definitely want to give it a little bit of a kick in the highlights here. And now we see a little bit more color contrast here happening than before. So essentially, this is where I start. Then I'm going to start to boost some of these things here and bring the brightness back into the image. Let me turn that on. I'm going to show you this little trick that I'm using from time to time, and here it's called turn green to red. Now, it's actually in Photoshop something called the channel mixer, and essentially, if from the red channel, if you put green to 200% and blue to minus 200%, everything that's green in your image is going to turn into red. So when I boost this in here, you see that all of a sudden I get really nice kind of red boost here. So I've got it in lighten mode, and you see it's blended at 18%. If I didn't have it like that, let's put it at 100% in regular mode, you'll see it'll get like crazy like this, all right? So typically I use it in lighten, and then I choose how much of that I want to blend in and to reinforce that red thing. So 18% here was just the right amount to bring that up. After that, I'll have some levels, and here I've just brought in the midtone a little bit, and then some curves to make it a little bit brighter. So essentially, bring that up a little bit. And I'm starting to get some nice colors here happening that I can start to work on. And here's my color grade section. And here, like I said, I add these selective colors where I'm going to start to play with each of these sliders. So red here is going to boost the red a little bit more, adding a little bit more vibrance. Green, I don't think I'm doing anything with the green here. I think with the cyan, I'm just adding a tiny little bit. Now, one thing that I want you to notice is I don't have any of these things making a massive difference. It's all slowly but surely stacking up. I think if you try to overdo anything with some of these layers, you're going to get in trouble later on. So I'm slowly bringing some of these elements up. Magenta here, the magenta actually cleaned up a bit of that cast in the background. And then one of my favorite things I love using is shifting the neutrals. So the neutral here, by shifting the magenta and the black and cyan a little bit, I'm actually bringing some nice purple hues into the image, and it makes it also a little bit brighter, shifting the magenta towards the green. One thing about trying to nuke green out of the images every time is that you really have to understand that green actually controls the amount of brightness the image has. So if you nuke the green, it's going to look really dark. So here, bringing a bit of extra clarity, black to neutralize the background a little bit, and then a little bit of vibrance. So essentially, we go from no color grade to a little bit more color vibrance here. Cool. So now the layer after that is, I'm about to bring the color, the luminance here, but often if I zoom in here, you will see there's a little bit of color noise. Now, a traditional way of dealing with the color noise is to actually grab that color map you have and blur it. So I tend to use Gaussian blur. I can't see it here at 4 pixel. And when I do this, bang, it's going to blur the color map. Now, don't worry about the details. We're going to recover that through the luminance layer, which is here. And when I bring that layer back in, all of a sudden, I get all the details back in without the color noise. So this was without it. We see a little bit of color noise here and with the blurred. So it's really nice at getting rid of color noise like this. Now let's have a look at the luminosity here. So the luminosity, same thing that I've edited using kind of these techniques that I was trying to show you earlier. Really get that as good as I can so I can bring it in the main edit. But here you see, if I just have a look at just the luminosity layer, I like all the details that are coming up, but I think, unfortunately, I kind of nuked the black a little bit too much. And it's really kind of noticeable when you start to bring everything together here. So let me show you. Oh, now I need to do everything one by one again. That's all right. Here we go. I'm sure there's a faster way of doing this. I must forget something. Here we go. So let's put color map back on. So as I'm bringing this in here, now you see this is the background of my RGB. And as I'm bringing my luminosity layer, the background now really kind of gets dark, too dark, and I actually don't like that. So what I like is to bring that background that I add in that nice kind of color layer and bring that onto the luminance layer. So what I did essentially is to not have a luminance layer, not have a blurred image. And what you can do here is print that image as an additional layer. So I think for me, it's Shift Option Command E. And if I do that, it's actually going to bring whatever is on the image and bring it as an extra layer up here. So I let that print. It's a pretty big image, so it's going to do its thing. Here you go. So I've got that layer. And what I'm going to do with that layer, since I want to bring that kind of back in, I'm going to put that above the luminance layer. I already did this here, but I'm going to show it to you. And essentially what I want to do is put that in lighten mode. Where is lighten? Here. And essentially it's going to bring back areas that were lighter in the color map back into the image. So now when I go with and without the luminance layer, my background is not changing, and something that looks better to me here at this stage. So that's a nice way here of dealing with that bit. Now, the problem with this is if I zoom in, I'm going to get a whole bunch of noise from that background here by bringing that in. So what you can do here, maybe you can either blur it a little bit or use, noise exterminator to just remove some of that stuff. And you see here, I've got a layer where I said I use it at 50/20. And I can do that again. And here it's going to take care of that noise, and I'm bringing that back into the image. I don't really want that. I just want the background that was in the color layer to come up a little bit lighter. And here, that's a much nicer way of bringing that together. Cool. Then I've got my sharpening. Now the sharpening, the way I like to do this is grab the luminance layer, copy that, put it right at the top, and then go into filter, over, IPass. And essentially here, what you're going to do, you're going to choose, I tend to do it on 4 pixel scale, a really, really fine one to sharpen the really sharp detail. And here you're going to see what it's grabbing. I'm going to do this one here. And I'm going to do another one paste that luminance filter again, and then go over high pass. And then I may have one that's a little bit higher. And then I may have another one for larger scale details. Let's go here, high pass, and let's go larger scale details. Cool. Now what you want to do with these layers is turn them into soft light, all of them, and soft light. And now essentially what it's going to do, it's going to really increase the sharpening like crazy. And you may want to turn them off and start to blend them in. So this is, for example, the really fine scale detail. Now by doing that, it's also going to bring the noise. So you're going to need to be careful with that. Here, I'm bringing a little bit of additional contrast. Here, this one, I'm bringing more large scale structure. This is a bit too much. I'm going to bring down the opacity here. Go in and out, see what I'm doing. And then the large scale structure, let's bring back here. Okay, this is way too much. I'm going to start bringing that down. Okay, cool. So I will grab these and I will put them into a new layer group from these layers. And essentially now I can turn that whole thing on and off, and I can choose how much of it I want. What I tend to do is that I tend to go in here and go layer mask, idle, and then with the brush, where's my brush? Here. And with size here, let's say opacity at 50%, I can slowly start bringing in where I want that sharpening to happen and not necessarily be everywhere. Bring the size up here a little bit, and I can slowly bring the details in where I want the details to be. For example, these things, I really love them, but when they over sharpen, they don't really look good. So I'm not going to sharpen those. I'm going to sharpen the edges here. And again, trying to bring some depth into the image. And this is how I kind of do my additional sharpening like this. So that's what I use. And this is a really kind of nice way to blending sharpening in your color map and the luminance combined together. Then a little bit of extra vibrance here. I love using vibrance and not saturation. I'm getting nicer kind of color blends using this. And then essentially I grab all these guys and I make a new layer group that you see I have here, main edit. And then I turn that into a smart object. So you click on this and you can convert to smart object. And what this is going to allow me to do is to put a smart filter on this. So smart filter are all these filters that are here. You can't use them as adjustment layers like I can with these guys. And camera raw is definitely one of my favorite to use. And here, by using it that way, I can have access to it and I can right click on it and start to edit that smart filter. Now I'll show you a little bit the way I'm using this one. So in light here, what did I do? I just added, brought in the shadows a little bit more, reduced the highlight. I added a little bit of vibrance. I love using the color mixer here. There's also this new tool now called point color, where you can literally point at a color like this, for example, and I can completely shift the hue from here. Now, you have to be very careful with this because I found that sometimes it's really noticeable. You can create not very smooth transition from one color to the other, so I tend to be very careful with that. But anyway, great tool. There's so much really cool stuff in there. Also, sometimes for those of you kind of denoise image too much, you can actually bring back something, kind of an effect called grain. And sometimes you can bring back a little bit of a grain in the image, and that high level noise actually sometimes makes the image look a little bit more realistic. So this is what you can do. I'm going to cancel this because I've already done it. And here you have it as a layer, and literally I can double click on that and choose how much, right click. Where is it? Here. There's one where you can control the amount of blend. And that's really cool. You can choose how much of what you did here you can bring. So again, full control. So almost there. Now let's have a look. I've got a couple little extra tricks that we're going to go through. The one thing is color fill with a black layer. I'm going to show you this here. And what it's doing is neutralizing the background. So I'm going to show you how to do this. So right now, if I zoom in onto the background, you know, it's pretty noisy. It's not looking very, very nice. So what I like to do is through this little guy here, I will create a solid color fill. And this is what I like my background to be, 30, 30, 30. So, and now I'm going to put that layer in lighten mode, and pretty much anything that's darker than that is going to be removed. The problem here is that you see it goes from something a little bit grainy to super smooth. So it's not exactly what you want. Of course, you can control here how much you want that to be blended. But still, even if I wanted a little bit higher here, there's not noise in it, and that kind of looks weird. So to fix this, I can right click on this and go convert to smart object. And then I can go filter, noise, add noise, and actually bring back a bit of Gaussian noise, let's say maybe at 2%. And you see here now I'm starting to match the level of noise that's in here with what's in the black. So now it doesn't look so weird. And then I can reduce it a little bit in what I'm bringing in. And it's really smoothing out that dark background nicely and cleaning up the image a little bit. So that's one thing I'm doing. And then last step, maybe a little bit of kind of color reduction, not color reduction, noise reduction. It's looking pretty good in the bright areas, but here it's really starting to get noisy, and I may want to kind of fix that up a little bit. So what I tend to do here is, again, is Shift Option Command E. I mean, I could use another smart object, but here I'm just going to do that for denoise purposes. So I'm going to denoise this. I'm going to go filter. I'm going to go noise exterminator. This might be, yeah. Use that at 50%. Let's have a look. Now it's definitely going to get rid of a lot of that noise, but I didn't want that noise to be reduced in the center. So maybe what I can do here is on that layer, the denoise layer, I'm going to make a selection of what I don't want to be denoised. Let's say this section here. Roughly, you don't have to be like super mega precise here because I'm going to favor this in a second. Maybe like even on this. Cool. And here I'm going to go in that layer and I'm going to make layer mask, and I want to reveal the selection. So that makes a mask for me. And here what it's doing right now is this is being covered and this is not being denoised. Let's put that higher here. And then what you can do with this is then favor the mask. So if you see, this is the mask right now, but if I use this, you can actually favor the mask and actually see the way it's going to look like in the image, and if it looks natural, the transition between these two layers here, if that's working naturally. And if it does, then you're good to go. And that's the way I kind of dealt with this little thing. And then I put the stars back in, screen stars. You can, with a level, just adjust, you know, the size of the stars to kind of get a little bit of a feel for the way you want to have the stars to look in your image. But I don't recombine the stars in Photoshop. I do it in PixInsight. So essentially in PixInsight, I'm going to export that starless out of Photoshop and bring it into PixInsight with the stars layers. So you're going to end up with these two things here. And what I'm going to do is use this little awesome script called Screen Stars. Check these guys out. It's all free tools, great stuff to use. And I'm going to select starless, and here star view, I'm going to select star layer. And here essentially you've got this thing here, which is what I'm using it for, enable reverse stretch. So let's zoom in here a little bit on the stars. Enable stretch is the river stretch is on right now. If it was off, what happens is that the all of the stars are clipped and I don't get as much color. Here I will be able to get much better color out of that. And then I hit process and I'm good to go. If I wanted to do any star reduction, which I really don't do much these days because I just stretch the stars to the way I want them to look like, you could use another script that these guys are making called star reduction. Really good script also, especially for LRGB stuff. So you have a starless version, I have my starless version here already preloaded. I can protect the small stars, so it doesn't reduce the small stars, only the big one. And you have every single reduction method under the sun just available in a drop-down menu, which makes it super easy to use. So here, same thing. Let's zoom in on this section here. So I can use the star method, transfer method, halo method, lightness method, whichever you want, and then choose how much of it you are applying. So here, for example, I'm not applying it to the small stars. It's only applying to the big stars. But here, I don't think this image needs it. So that's a good way of doing it. And then finally, you export that. And often I want to actually export that as a TIFF and have literally load it in my preview window on my computer, as I found that Photoshop and PixInsight somehow don't give you the sharpest resolution in screen preview. And by actually having a look at it like this, it really gives you a good feel for the image you got here at the end. And then I should be able to zoom in and it not collapse on itself and look decent both in and out of the frame. So that's about it. That's how I do my thing, reintroducing the stars, the river stretch enabled, and yeah. That's what I got for you. Any particular questions after this journey?
Steve, I don't see any questions. There was a lot to present there and a lot to absorb, so I think probably our audience is going to go back and say, what did he really do?
Yeah, that's
certainly,
what
certainly I am, because we all have different techniques. I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about operating by means of masking on different sections of, say, the emission nebula, because they all have different contributions from S8 and the O, and if you do it globally, I know you use a couple of maps, but if you do it globally, it's hard to get them to balance all the right way.
Well, yeah, no, I do a very good point. I do that a lot actually. And by the way, things were mapped here, for example. If you use the curves layer and instead I go to the red, the green, or the blue, I can literally boost the oxygen here by just doing this. But also another thing that I'm doing, which is actually in the luminance layer, maybe I'll show you this here, is sometimes I screen, for example, for me to be able to bring the for example, I screened, I have a sulfur as a mask on the HA, so I can bring more of the sulfur into the image and kind of diminish the contribution of the HA where the sulfur is and do things like that. So yeah, I do use things like that often. Also, like local control, for example, if I start with a HA, here we see the HA is really kind of bright in this section. What I like to do is control the dynamic range of certain part of the image by, doing something like this here, or I may select something like this, and then go new adjustment layer, maybe curves, bring that down,
Probably feather that.
and then feather it out.
Yeah.
All right, and that kind of stuff you can really kind of control dynamically. And here you see I've reduced that too much, so it's cool. I can go on the mask, and I can with this go black and make that a little bit more natural. So for example, now, the sulfur, for example, in this image, if I just bring the sulfur on its own as just a regular layer, not enlightened, it has a truckload of details that's just not, it's just not in the HA, even when I bring down the brightness. So I'm going to bring that in because it's getting overwhelmed by HA right now. So even if I put that in lighten, which only adds what's brighter on top of it, well, it's not brighter, so nothing is coming up. And this is where you may have to apply a curve, for example, and here I boost a curve to bring that up in the image, and all of a sudden I can see it. So
Or use it as a high pass filter too.
yeah. So there's so many different techniques. I guess I try to synthesize it into something kind of simple people can follow. A lot of that stuff I got from Craig Stock as well from watching your channel and how he uses Photoshop. And there's a lot of stuff he does that I'm doing.
By the way, before we forget, after the program is over, you're welcome to stay and chat with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if it's not, I guess it's not too late where you are, is it?
No. Yeah, I'm right in the middle of the day. It's late for you guys, but yeah, I'm cool. I've got my whole day in front of me. But yeah,
There's a question. Oh, the question came up.
Yeah.
Have you tried Bill Blanchin's narrowband normalization process in PI?
What is that? Is that for the color mapping stuff?
I don't know. That's Bill Blanchin's narrowband normalization process.
No.
I don't know what that is.
I don't think I have. What does it do?
I have no idea.
I have no idea. No, but I have not tried.
Maybe I think maybe you could just put a little comment there and we'll read it in.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'll definitely check it out. I love these kind of little scripts in PI. I just don't do the compositing in PI because I need layers. I need to be able to bypass stuff and use the opacity. And I think masking in Photoshop is a million times better. So anyway, that's just me.
Well, here, let me raise my hand on that too as well. This is not religion; they're tools.
No, 100%. And I see some people really getting really serious.
Religious,
about,
yes,
the Pixie Size Church and the Photoshop Church. No, these are tools. It's just don't worry about that stuff. Like, how is the image in the end? Is it something you want to look at? And great. I don't care if you did it in on your phone.
Isaac said that is a blending.
Yeah, like the blending, to me, I'm a sound mixer. I want to be able to turn on things on and off and realize, you know what, I overdid this. Or I get to the end and realize, in the mastering stage, I'm really not getting what I need. I've got too much of this going on. I've made a mistake in the edit. I've put too much of the sulfur and now it's creating an issue. I can go back, fix that, save that layer. It automatically updates the smart object, and then I can slowly get things together. To me,
what color palette do you use when you save, like for a JPEG?
Yes, so good one. So if I print, if I want this to go to print, it's you can convert to a profile, and I tend to use Adobe RGB 9098.
Huh?
Yeah.
So do I.
And but sRGB most of the time because it's going on the screen, pretty much.
Yeah.
What do you guys use?
The same thing.
Yeah,
I
same
use
thing.
more of 98 even for some screen because I kind of like the
colors.
I like the histogram a little bit better
Mm.
than the colors, but
Yeah, it's something
Yeah,
really
that's the
important.
trouble. You've got the lowest common denominator of, most people are looking at these images on computer screens, and it's sRGB is kind of what they have, and they may be calibrated, they may not. So
Well, yeah, exactly. And one thing that I want to say is my screen is calibrated. Okay, I use a spider to make the screen as good as I possibly can. If you're serious about processing, you got to work with a calibrated screen. Otherwise, you have no idea what you're doing and how it's going to translate. Doesn't matter how good you are at processing. Same thing with sound mixing. If I've got crappy speakers, it's going to be really hard for me to understand what I'm doing. And you're going to have translation issues. So calibrated screen.
we've had that comment before. Calibrate your screens, and I would guess a very small percentage of the people actually do calibrate their screens.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy that people don't calibrate the screens.
And we have
you-
a show about it too. I'll put the link in.
Yep.
Yeah, so
We
really,
might do it, but
and
a
for
lot of
example,
folks don't.
I don't have a spider. I've got a friend of mine who's a photographer. I borrowed his spider, calibrate my screen, save that as a profile, and that's what I've got for my screen. I do have one of his MacBook Pros M2 chip though, and the screen on this thing is amazing. You don't need to calibrate it. It's like insanely good. So I use that as well. But yeah.
I use an X-Rite. What is it? An X1 X-Rite that sits on the front of the screen. Actually, Tim recommended it
Yeah.
for calibration.
Yeah,
That's
it's good.
the same one I use too. It works well, but they're all, I mean, they're all close to each other, and certainly some calibration over no calibration,
And look,
hands down is better. But we've all had that experience where you've got your calibrated monitor, you put everything the way you want it, and then you show it to your friend, and they look at it at their computer on their computer at work or something.
saturation is on.
This looks terrible, right? So
And-
what
but
you gotta
Even with
do.
all that, before I post anything, I'll look at it on 4 of my screens, only one of which is calibrated.
And look, I'm going to make an analogy with sound, but like with sound, for example, most people in the car, what are they going to play with? The bass and the treble. Most of the times that's going to be maxed out. But one thing they never play with is the mid-range. And guess what it is for images? Contrast and brightness. All right. So your black point and your white point. The one thing they never mess with is the middle. So you need to get your grays and your midpoint really, really good on your images for it to have a chance to translate onto fairly crappy monitors. So getting that subtleties right in the middle of the Instagram is, I think, what's super important for translation.
Besides, when they're listening to sounds in the car, they got 50 decibels of road noise
Well,
right on
that's it.
top of that.
That's the
If you put too
uncalibrated
much
monitor,
bass-
right?
If you put too much bass in your mix, it's going to come out absolutely unlistenable out there. So again, that's
Now-
something you do.
Do I detect just a slight amount of audio mixing in your Photoshop processor?
100%, 100%. It was
Yeah.
actually a completely. I could transfer all these skills. It's something that I do a lot in sound mixing. It's turning layers off and then bringing them back in. So I give myself a different perspective. So I actually really understand what these layers do in context. And that's kind of what I love to do in Photoshop. Turn the HA off, turn it back on. Oh, I see where it's adding and where it's adding things I don't like. These are the areas I need to fix. And that changes from image to image up until I get something that I like. Really important for
Nice.
me. And
I see Molly posted the link to the monitor calibration. Thanks.
oh, excellent. Cool. I'll
We,
definitely
we
check
all need to reminder. I think I'm going after I'm feeling guilty, I should go recalibrate my monitor now.
that. But look, and same thing for audio. I've made good records on crappy speakers because I've learned with crappy speakers how they sounded. So if you really know your monitor and you know that it's supposed to bleed red that much and you've looked so much content through that monitor, sometimes as long as you really understand what your monitor does and you can play with that, I've done decent images without a calibrated screen just because I understood the monitor I played with. So it's not a requirement, but it does help. Cool.
Yes, it does. Well, Steve, this has been a really impressive presentation. Tons of useful information. Your post-processing skills are quite impressive. So, and I really appreciated your composition tips as well. I think with astrophotography, right, there's so many details to keep track of just from the technical standpoint that sometimes it's just happy you get, oh, hey, you got a good image and you got it right in the middle and perfect. So it's easy to overlook some of those more traditional photography factors that really add to the impact of the image. So
Yeah, I think
thank
it's
you
really
so
important.
much.
Yeah, we're doing this to share it, and our hope is for people to stare at this and just trigger, their imagination. We want them to stare at it. So anything you can do for these eyes to stay on that image, then it's worth doing.
Absolutely. Well, and certainly we mentioned it earlier, but everybody go take a look at Steve's Astrobin portfolio. there's a lot of really good stuff on there with these techniques have gotten him there. So with that, I think we got all the questions. And
Thank you very much.
Terry, so you're running the show tonight, so take us out whenever you're ready.
Faders out, fade out.
Yeah, fade out.
Fade out. Good night, everyone.